Sterling Whitmore stepped out of his sleek black town car, adjusting the cuff of his $1,000 suit as he scanned the entrance of the grand ballroom. The event was supposed to be a high-profile investor gala, an evening of polite handshakes, strategic networking, and most importantly, a chance to finalize a multi-million-dollar merger. But the moment he stepped inside, he realized something was off. Instead of a room filled with power-hungry CEOs and hedge fund managers, the ballroom was alive with laughter, warm chatter, and a distinctly different kind of energy. There were no tuxedos or diamond-clad socialites. Instead, people in cocktail dresses and semi-formal attire moved between buffet tables and auction stands. A large banner hung over the stage, annual charity benefit for community arts programs. This was definitely not the right event. Before he could turn around and leave, a woman stepped in front of him, her smile bright and warm. "Welcome," she greeted. "I'm Natalie Warren. Thank you so much for coming tonight." Sterling was momentarily stunned. She had the kind of presence that pulled people in, eyes bright with excitement, a natural warmth in her voice. Her dark brown hair was swept into a loose updo, a few strands falling around her face in an effortlessly elegant way. She was wearing a deep blue dress that hugged her figure just enough to be stunning but still appropriate for the occasion. For a moment, he forgot he had somewhere else to be. He cleared his throat, straightening his posture. "I think I might be in the wrong place." Natalie's smile didn't falter. "Well, you're here now," she said, gesturing toward the room. "And it's for a good cause. We're raising funds for underprivileged kids to have access to art and music programs. You're welcome to stay, enjoy some food, and maybe even bid on something at the auction." Sterling hesitated. He had never been one for small charity events like this. His world was built on power, precision, and calculated decisions. He didn't spend his evenings at community benefits, he spent them closing deals. But something about the way Natalie was looking at him, open and inviting, made it impossible to just walk away. "All right," he said, surprising himself. "I'll stay for a little while." Her smile widened. "Great, let me introduce you to some people." Before he knew it, she was leading him through the crowd, introducing him to volunteers, donors, and artists. Sterling wasn't used to this kind of environment. People weren't trying to impress him, they were just genuinely passionate about the cause. And Natalie. She was at the center of it all. She knew everyone by name, laughed easily, and had a way of making people feel like they belonged. He watched as she stopped to chat with an older woman about the success of last year's scholarship recipients, then turned to encourage a nervous young artist about his upcoming showcase. She cared. And for some reason, that fascinated him. "So Sterling," Natalie said as they reached the silent auction table, "what do you do?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second. He didn't want to see that moment of recognition in her eyes, the one that usually came when people realized who he was. The CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, a billionaire, a man whose name was attached to half the skyscrapers in the city. Instead, he found himself saying, "I run a company." "A company," she teased, raising an eyebrow. "That's vague." He smirked slightly. "A pretty big one." She laughed, mysterious. "I like it." For the first time in years, Sterling wasn't being treated like a powerful businessman. He was just a guy at a charity event talking to a woman who intrigued him. When she wasn't looking, he glanced at the auction list and on impulse placed a $10,000 bid on a painting. He didn't even know what it was, he just liked the idea of supporting something she was passionate about. As the evening went on, Sterling found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. He wasn't calculating his next move or thinking about business. He was just there listening, laughing, and watching Natalie light up as she talked about the kids the program helped. And when she turned to him with that brilliant smile, something shifted in his chest. He wasn't just staying out of politeness anymore. He was staying for her. As the event wound down, Natalie stood by the entrance, thanking guests as they left. When Sterling approached, a part of her didn't want him to go. "Leaving already?" she asked, tilting her head. "It's getting late," he said, but he didn't move. "Well, thank you for coming," she said genuinely, even if it was by accident. Sterling met her gaze, something unreadable in his expression. It was a good accident. Her breath caught for a moment. There was something about the way he said it, like he meant more than just the event. "Will I see you next year?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. He hesitated, then said, "Maybe sooner than that." And with that, he turned and walked out into the night, leaving Natalie standing there, heart racing, wondering if she had just met someone who would change everything. Sterling wasn't used to being distracted. His life was built on focus, on precision, on ensuring that every moment of his day was accounted for. And yet, nearly a week after the charity event, his thoughts kept drifting back to Natalie Warren. He had looked her up the next morning. It was an easy enough task when you ran an empire. You had access to information most people didn't. Natalie had founded the community arts program herself, pouring years into building something from nothing. She wasn't just passionate, she was relentless in her dedication, constantly fundraising, organizing, and advocating for the kids in her program. That kind of drive was something Sterling respected. Which was why, despite his better judgment, he found himself standing outside the modest brick building that housed the program's headquarters. It was a stark contrast to the glass skyscrapers he was used to, but there was something about it that felt real. He stepped inside, and within moments the sound of laughter and conversation filled his ears. The walls were covered in colorful murals, and the air smelled faintly of paint and fresh paper. A group of kids were gathered around an instructor, carefully sketching on large sheets of paper, while another group worked on a sculpture in the corner. And then he saw her. Natalie was crouched beside a little girl, gently guiding her hand as she painted bold strokes onto a canvas. She was focused, completely immersed in the moment, and for a brief second, Sterling hesitated. He wasn't sure why he was here. He wasn't the type to drop in unannounced. But then she glanced up, and her expression shifted from concentration to surprise. "Sterling," she stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. "What are you doing here?" He wasn't entirely sure how to answer that. "I wanted to see what you do," he admitted. "I figured it was better than reading about it in an article." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then, with a small tilt of her head, she gestured toward the room. "Well, this is it," she said. "Welcome to the chaos." He followed her as she walked through the space, explaining the different programs they offered. It was clear how much this place meant to her, every detail, every success story, every challenge. When they reached the back of the room, she turned to face him. "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting you to show up. I don't usually do things like this." "Things like what?" "Drop by places without a reason." Natalie folded her arms. "So what's your reason?" He could have said anything. That he was interested in philanthropy, that he was considering making a donation, that he was simply curious. Instead, he told the truth. "Are you?" For the first time since they had met, Natalie didn't have a quick response. Her expression softened, and for a moment the noise of the room seemed to fade into the background. Then one of the kids called her name, and just like that, the moment was gone. "I should get back to work," she said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Sterling nodded. "I won't keep you." But as he turned to leave, she spoke again. "There's a showcase this weekend," she said. "Some of the kids are presenting their work. You should come." He met her gaze. "You really think I'd fit in at something like that?" Natalie smiled, and there was something teasing in the way she said, "You fit in just fine at the gala." He considered that for a moment before giving a single nod. "I'll be there." And this time when he walked out, he knew he wasn't just leaving. He was coming back. The gallery was packed. Guests moved between displays, admiring the artwork that lined the walls: paintings, sketches, sculptures, each piece created by the students in Natalie's program. The energy in the room was contagious: excited chatter, bursts of laughter, the occasional exclamation of awe over a particularly striking piece. Sterling had been to countless events in his life. High-profile galas, luxury brand launches, exclusive fundraisers where the champagne flowed endlessly and the conversations were all about power and influence. But this was different. It wasn't about prestige, it was about passion, about people. And at the center of it all was Natalie. She moved through the crowd effortlessly, stopping to congratulate students, introducing guests to the young artists, making sure no one felt out of place. She wasn't just organizing the event, she was the heartbeat of it. Sterling had arrived alone, slipping into the crowd without drawing much attention. He was used to commanding a room the moment he entered, but tonight he simply observed. Then Natalie spotted him. "You actually came," she said, stepping toward him. "I said I would." "Most people in your world don't follow through on things like this." He raised an eyebrow, and what world is that? She studied him for a moment before tilting her head toward a nearby display. "Come on, let me show you something." She led him to a painting, a striking piece, full of chaotic color and bold strokes. "One of my students, Mateo, painted this," she explained. "He used to get in trouble all the time, couldn't sit still in class, never turned in his homework. Everyone thought he was a lost cause." Sterling glanced at the painting again, and now. "He's applying to art school," she said. "Got a scholarship because of this program." Her voice carried something deeper than pride. It was belief. Sterling had built his empire on strategy, on numbers, on knowing how to turn a failing company into a billion-dollar success. But this wasn't about profit margins or market value. This was about changing lives. "You care about them," he said, more as a realization than a question. Natalie turned toward him. "Of course I do." Most people he knew only cared about things that benefited them. She was different. Before he could respond, a woman approached, older, elegant, with a sharp gaze that took everything in at once. "Natalie, darling," she said smoothly, "the press wants a few words from you." Natalie's expression shifted slightly, the warmth dimming just a fraction. "I'll be right there," she said. The woman glanced at Sterling, then back at Natalie, her lips curving just enough to imply curiosity. "I don't believe we've met," she said. Before Sterling could introduce himself, Natalie did it for him. "This is Sterling Whitmore," she said. "He's been supporting the program." The woman's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. "Whitmore," she mused, "as in Whitmore Enterprises." He gave a single nod. "A billionaire taking an interest in a small arts program," her gaze flickered toward Natalie. "That's unexpected." Something in Natalie's posture stiffened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Excuse me," she said, "I need to check on the students." She stepped away, leaving Sterling alone with the woman. She studied him for a moment. "I assume you're aware of what you're getting into." He met her gaze evenly, and what exactly would that be? "Natalie doesn't play games," she said. "She's not a socialite looking for a ticket into your world. If you're here out of curiosity, I suggest you leave before you waste her time." Sterling's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. "I don't waste people's time," he said. The woman gave a knowing smile. "Then I hope for her sake that's true." With that, she turned and walked away. Sterling exhaled slowly, glancing toward where Natalie had disappeared into the crowd. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but one thing was clear: Natalie wasn't just another person to be impressed or charmed. And for the first time in years, he found himself wanting to be someone worth proving right. Sterling stood outside the gallery long after the event had ended, watching as the last guests trickled out into the night. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see Natalie speaking with one of her students, her expression animated, her hands moving as she encouraged them. Even now, when the event was over and exhaustion had to be creeping in, she was still giving every ounce of her energy to the people she believed in. It was a stark contrast to the world he came from. He was used to people who only exerted effort when there was something to gain, investors who measured their generosity in returns, executives who calculated every move. But Natalie, she gave without hesitation, without expectation. And somehow, she had managed to make him care about something beyond balance sheets and board meetings. He stepped inside just as she turned, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. "I thought you left," she said, brushing a stray curl from her face. "I was waiting for you." There was something unspoken between them in that moment. The weight of the past few weeks, the unexpected connection that neither of them had expected but neither wanted to deny. Natalie exhaled, shaking her head slightly. Sterling, she hesitated as if trying to find the right words. Don't know what this is, don't know what it means. He took a step closer, then let's figure it out. Her lips parted slightly, and he could see the struggle in her eyes. She wanted to believe him to believe that this wasn't just a passing interest, that he wasn't just another powerful man who would lose interest when the novelty wore off. I'm not like the women you know, she finally said. I'm not going to be impressed by your money or your influence. I don't want you to be, he said without hesitation. I want you to see me the way you did the first night we met, when I was just some guy who walked into the wrong event. She studied him for a long moment. That night, you were different. You weren't trying to be anything other than who you were in that moment. I still am, he said, at least when I'm with you. Something in her expression softened, but uncertainty still lingered. Sterling, my life is here, with these kids, with this program. Can't just drop everything and disappear into your world. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I know, he said, handing it to her. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the printed text. Then she looked up sharply. This is a donation. A substantial one, he confirmed. Her breath caught. This could fund our program for years. He nodded. That's the point. She looked at him, something unreadable in her gaze. Why are you doing this? Because I believe in what you're doing, he said. Because I've seen what it means to you, to them. He gestured toward the students who were still cleaning up after the event, and because I want to be a part of it. Her fingers tightened slightly on the paper. You don't have to do this to prove something to me. I'm not, he said simply. I'm doing it because I want to. Silence stretched between them, heavy with emotions neither of them had spoken aloud. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, I don't know how this happened. He gave a small, knowing look. Neither do I, but I'm not going to walk away from it. For the first time since he had met her, she didn't push back, she didn't argue or deflect. Instead, she stepped closer, her voice quieter now. This isn't going to be easy. Nothing worth having ever is. She exhaled, shaking her head slightly, but there was a hint of something else now. Hope. Okay, she said softly. It was just one word, but it was enough. And when Sterling reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. Sterling's world had always been one of control. He dictated terms, orchestrated outcomes, ensured that nothing was left to chance. But with Natalie, control didn't exist. She wasn't a deal to be negotiated or a problem to be solved. She was a force unpredictable, vibrant, and completely unwilling to be swayed by power or wealth. And yet, despite every instinct that told him this was unfamiliar ground, he couldn't stay away. Over the next few weeks, Sterling found himself stepping further into her world. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. One evening, he arrived at the art center unannounced, carrying 2 cups of coffee. The place was quieter than usual, the students having left for the day, but Natalie was still there, surrounded by scattered papers and half-finished projects. She looked up when he stepped inside, exhaustion flickering across her face before she smiled. You're going to make a habit of this, aren't you? She said, setting her pencil down. He handed her the coffee. You work late, someone has to make sure you don't pass out from exhaustion. She took a sip, sighing in appreciation. Careful, Whitmore, you're dangerously close to being thoughtful. His lips twitched. I'm full of surprises. She leaned back against the table, studying him. You really don't have to keep showing up like this. I know. Then why do you? He held her gaze. Because I want to. She hesitated as if weighing his words, then placed the coffee beside her. You're not what I expected. He tilted his head slightly. And what did you expect? She exhaled, choosing her words. Someone who would lose interest once the novelty wore off. Someone who would see this place as entertainment. His expression darkened slightly. That's not me. I'm starting to believe that. A beat passed between them, the air charged with something unspoken. Then, before the moment could stretch too long, she shifted the papers in front of her. I have to finalize the budget proposal for next quarter, she said, brushing hair from her face. Turns out making a difference takes a lot of paperwork. Sterling glanced at the notes scattered across the table. Let me see. She hesitated before sliding the papers toward him. He scanned them quickly, his business instincts kicking in. You're underselling some of your sponsorship opportunities, he said. If you adjust the donor tiers, you could secure more long-term commitments. She blinked. You just read that in 30 seconds. He looked up. I do this for a living. She shook her head, amused. Forget sometimes that you're one of the most powerful men in the city. I don't mind that you forget. Something passed between them again, something that neither of them labeled. Then Natalie exhaled, rolling her shoulders. All right, Whitmore, if you think you can help, show me how. He pulled up a chair, and for the next 2 hours they worked side by side. A week later, Sterling invited Natalie to dinner. Not in the extravagant, over-the-top way he was used to entertaining, not at some exclusive rooftop restaurant where the waiters wore tuxedos and the meals were plated like works of art. Instead, he brought her to a quiet, intimate spot tucked away from the city's chaos. A place where the lighting was soft, the food was rich with flavor, and the world outside seemed to slow. She raised an eyebrow as they sat down. I was expecting something with a Michelin star. He shrugged, figured you'd appreciate something real over something expensive. She studied him for a long moment before nodding. You figured right. As the evening went on, the conversation drifted into places neither of them had explored before. She told him about growing up in a family that didn't always understand her passion for art, about how she had fought to build the program from scratch, scraping together grants and donations, pushing through every setback. He told her about the weight of expectations, about inheriting an empire before he had fully figured out who he was, about the pressure to always be in control. For the first time in a long time, Sterling wasn't performing. He wasn't the billionaire CEO. He wasn't the man who dictated boardroom decisions. He was just himself. And Natalie wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't caught up in his wealth or his influence. She was just a woman who believed in something bigger than herself. By the time dinner ended, something between them had shifted. As they stepped outside, the city lights casting a soft glow around them, she turned to him, her expression unreadable. This scares me, she admitted. He looked at her, surprised by the honesty. Why? Because I don't do things like this. I don't let people in easily. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. Neither do I. She hesitated for only a second before letting their hands fully intertwine. And for the first time in both of their lives, control didn't seem to matter. Sterling had thought he understood what it meant to want something. He had spent his life chasing success, building an empire, securing everything that people told him mattered. But when he looked at Natalie, when he saw the way she threw herself into her work, the way she fought for the things she believed in, he realized that wanting had never felt like this before. It wasn't about possession, it wasn't about control. It was about her. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of what came next. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of rain as Sterling arrived outside the art center. The building was dark except for a single light glowing from Natalie's office window. He had spent the better part of the day in meetings, negotiating a deal that would expand his company's reach internationally. It was a deal most men in his position would have celebrated. Yet as soon as he stepped away from the boardroom, all he could think about was her. He climbed the steps and pushed open the front door, the faint creak of the hinges echoing in the quiet space. Down the hall, Natalie sat at her desk, her brow furrowed as she flipped through a stack of documents. She hadn't noticed him yet. You work too much, he said, his voice breaking the silence. She looked up, startled for only a second before her lips curved in amusement. Says the man who probably hasn't seen his own bed in 2 days. He stepped inside, leaning against the doorway. Taché. Natalie set down her pen and stretched her arms above her head. What brings you here, business or personal? He pushed off the frame and crossed the room, resting his hands on the edge of her desk. Strictly personal. Her gaze flickered with something unreadable before she sighed. It's been a long day. The grant we were counting on fell through. His jaw tensed. Why? Some bureaucratic nonsense about reallocation of funds. She exhaled sharply and leaned back in her chair. It's not the first time something like this has happened. I'll figure it out. You shouldn't have to. She shrugged. That's the reality of running something like this. It's not always glamorous, but it's worth it. Sterling studied her for a moment, then pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Let me help. Natalie shook her head before he even finished speaking. I appreciate what you've already done, but I can't rely on you to fix everything. I'm not trying to fix everything, he said evenly. I just don't like watching you struggle when I have the means to make things easier. She folded her arms, tilting her head slightly. You're used to solving problems with money. He didn't deny it. It's an effective tool. Natalie's expression softened. This isn't just about money, it's about building something sustainable. If I let you fund everything, what happens when you decide you're done? Sterling's gaze darkened. You think I'll walk away? She hesitated, then admitted, that's what people do. His fingers curled slightly against the desk. I'm not most people. She searched his face as if trying to decipher the depth of his words. Then more softly she said, I know. A beat of silence passed, charged with something heavier than before. Then Sterling reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope, sliding it across the desk. Natalie eyed it warily. What's this? He gestured for her to open it. She did, carefully unfolding the paper inside. Her eyes widened as she scanned the contents. This is a partnership agreement, she murmured. Sterling leaned forward. You keep full control of the program. My company provides annual funding without interference. No strings attached. She blinked, looking up at him. Why would you do this? Because I believe in what you're doing, he said without hesitation. Because I believe in you. Her fingers tightened around the paper. She shook her head at a rare loss for words. Say yes, he said, his voice quieter now. Let me be part of this in a way that makes sense for both of us. For the first time that night, Natalie's guard cracked. She exhaled slowly, then nodded. Okay. He didn't say anything, but the relief in his eyes was unmistakable. She smiled. You really don't know how to take no for an answer, do you? Sterling's lips curved slightly, not when it comes to things that matter. She held his gaze, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't going anywhere. Weeks passed, and the partnership breathed new life into the program. With financial stability secured, Natalie had space to focus on what she loved most, helping her students thrive. Sterling, true to his word, didn't interfere, but he was present more than she ever expected. He attended showcases, met with students, listened when she spoke about her vision for the future. And somewhere along the way, they stopped pretending this was anything but what it was: two people falling, fast and irrevocably, into something neither of them had expected. One evening, after a long day, Sterling took her to the rooftop of a high-rise overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered below, and as they stood side by side, he reached into his pocket. Natalie turned just as he pulled out a velvet box. Her breath caught. He opened it, revealing a ring, elegant, timeless, perfect. I love you, he said, his voice steady, and I don't want to spend another day pretending like this isn't where I belong, with you. Natalie swallowed hard, emotion tightening her throat. He took her hand. Marry me. For the first time in her life, she didn't overthink, didn't hesitate. Oh yes. The moment the word left her lips, he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, kissing her with the kind of certainty that left no room for doubt. The wedding was intimate yet breathtaking. A garden ceremony under twinkling lights, surrounded by the people who had become their family. Sterling, ever the man of precision, had planned every detail to perfection. But when Natalie walked down the aisle, all his carefully curated plans melted into insignificance. She was radiant, her eyes locked onto his, and in that moment nothing else existed. When they exchanged vows, there was no hesitation, no lingering fear, only truth. And when he kissed her, sealing there forever, the world faded away. Because for the first time in both their lives, they had found something worth holding onto. And neither of them would ever let go.